Hey y'all, this is episode number 11. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Please subscribe, rate, and review this if you are enjoying the podcast, and share it with any friends that you think might enjoy it as well. Once again, thank you to Flavor Aid, who made the intro music you're about to hear. Their EP release party is going to be May 31st at Stubbs here in Austin, Texas. And their new single, Ghost in Me, is available on Spotify and all streaming services. What's up, y'all? This is the Sovereign Individual Podcast. I am your host, Eric Guerra, and today we are going to be talking about Veep. So this was the series on HBO starring Julia Louis-Dreyfus of Seinfeld fame, the great Elaine, who was hilarious on Seinfeld and is also hilarious in this show as well. And so the final season just ended, I think 2 weeks ago, or not this past Sunday, but the one before it, I believe is when it ended. I just finally got caught up with it and finished it up, and it just seemed like a good thing to kind of just talk about that show and kind of how it ended. And watching that last episode, I just got a lot of feelings, kind of reminiscent of the 2016 election and just kind of the political climate that we're experiencing right now, and kind of reinforced a lot of the things I already feel about government. But I think it's a good thing to kind of go over, and it's just very interesting to see. It was kind of a rush season. They only did 7 episodes, but it ended very well, and it's just kind of funny to see on the same network as Game of Thrones, a show that's going through a truncated final season, but doing it correctly. I mean, there were some things here or there, and the pacing was a little bit off, but not nearly as bad as it was with Game of Thrones. So it was just kind of funny seeing another show on that network be able to get to the finish line a lot more smoothly and have it make a lot more sense. So, if you haven't seen the show, I would highly I would highly recommend watching it. It's hilarious, really great show, great casting all around, and just wildly entertaining. And some of the best one-liners and quips and insults you'll ever hear. I think my favorite one is what is it? Crap, I'm trying to think of it now. There's a character on there named Jonah. We're gonna be talking about him, and his uncle at one point refers to him as a sentient enema, which is awesome. So basically the show is about this woman named Selena Kyle, and she is, when we open the show, she's the vice president of the United States, thus the name Veep. And so kind of to start out with, she's basically powerless. For all intents and purposes, the VP position, vice president position, is just ceremonial at best. There's not a whole lot you do. There's not a whole lot you're responsible for. You go and talk here and there, but you're pretty much powerless. So that's kind of where it starts, and you get introduced to her staff and different characters. Jonah works in the White House at that time, and he's like the liaison to the vice president's office. And so you just kind of go through that for the first season, 2 seasons. I think it's in the 3rd season. So basically she's kind of just preparing to be able to run for president, hopefully. And so her president, who you never actually get to see, President Hughes, but so at one point he decides that he's not going to be seeking re-election. So then Selena and the crew are preparing to make a run at president, and then he actually steps down at one point. He resigns, and so Selena becomes president with I can't remember, only a few months remaining in that term. I think maybe like 4 or 5. I can't remember exactly. And so then while she's president, during that short amount of time, she actually brokers a deal with the Chinese that would free Tibet. And so she's got that going for her. And then she ends up losing the election. So it kind of, and again, almost in the mirror of 2016, there's talk going into the 2016 election about, well, what happens if neither candidate meets the threshold for electoral votes. So that actually happens in the show. They end up tying, I think 268 apiece, because 270 is the magic number, so they tie it like 268 apiece, and it gets sent into the House. The House votes on it, and the House vote ends up being a tie, and then it goes to the Senate. And so basically the vice presidential candidates are going to end up being president. And so she ends up losing the election that way. So another female actually gets voted in, who was running as vice president in the opposition party. I mean, they don't come out and outright say it, but it's pretty clear that Selena Kyle is in the Democratic Party, so the opposite would be the Republican Party. And so, and then like during her inauguration, it's announced that she's already freed Tibet. So like this new president Montez gets credit for what Selena did. And then, so that kind of leads into what was the previous season, where she's kind of in her post White House life. And so she started a foundation, and she's trying to get a presidential library built and figuring that kind of stuff out. And she ends up taking money from an Eastern European dictator, a guy that runs, a for-profit prison guy, who she actually pardoned on her way out of the White House. And so just kind of running themes about stuff like that, of the shadiness of politicians and kind of their willingness to abandon principle, or claimed principles anyway, in order to get ahead. And so there's also a scene where, and this is kind of funny too, because it's a very, I think, blunt and honest look at kind of this whole lifestyle, this whole culture of elitism and what kind of occurs within the political sphere. She's at some sort of like peace conference and ends up throwing this female activist from Sudan under the bus, who she had said that she was going to stand up for and talk about, because I guess the Sudanese dictator, I think he was willing to donate money or something like that. Something went on to where she just basically in the middle of this speech just turned sharply and said that they were talking about female female circumcision, and the mutilation, the forced circumcision that was going on. And she basically says, well, we circumcise baby boys in America, so who are we to judge? And so just kind of backtracks on that. And it's just kind of, and the funny thing too is this peace conference has this Sudanese dictator there who's a war criminal and a warlord. And it just, again, kind of just shows this is what this kind of stuff can really be like. They don't really care about principles. They don't really care about being true to what it is they claim, if the money's right or the circumstances are right. And why not have a warlord there? And then towards the end of that season, one of her staff members, oh gosh, why am I blanking? What Sean Spicer was, and the press secretary. Okay, goodness gracious, Eric. So her press secretary keeps this journal like detailed journal of everything they do, and she's actually using that to help her write her book. And he loses it at one point, and somebody else in the press finds it and leaks everything, and so there's a bunch of scandal that breaks. But also from that, like, the truth about Tibet and Selena freeing Tibet breaks, and that leads into what became this final season, where she decides to run for president again, because now public opinion has turned and began to sway back into her favor, so that she would be able to make another run for it. So that leads into the final season. There's just kind of a lot of themes in this final season. There were also themes throughout the show, no doubt, that just kind of became poignant. One of them was just incompetence, and it's blatant within her staff, especially. I mean, those are the ones you get to see all the time, so you really get to see their incompetence. But then also, like, people who are referred to as, like, experts, or supposed to be really knowledgeable on subjects, or are supposed to be the best at what they do. A lot of people who are brought in to help her are viewed that are spoken about that way, and they turn out to be just as incompetent. And I think that's kind of an important thing to remember whenever talking about the state or the government. It's obvious how I feel about it, and I do think a lot of it, especially when it comes to the bureaucracy, is just malicious ill content by certain individuals, for sure, and certain individuals in positions of power or influence, for sure. But the other thing that I think is a huge part of it too is just incompetence. I think by and large, the government and the bureaucracy especially, is made up of just incompetent individuals. And it's kind of, inherent with, the job. It's kind of, when you're talking, especially when you're talking about the bureaucracy, you're talking about unelected people who get into these positions, and there's really no accountability whatsoever. So if they suck at their job, there's really no consequences for it. It's incredibly difficult in a lot of ways to fire individuals within the bureaucracy. There's a lot of, like, unions or different kind of protections that they have for their jobs, and so that kind of running theme throughout the show is also something to keep in mind when we're talking about the government. Like, it's made up of a lot of people who are incredibly incompetent at their jobs, and they don't face any consequences for that incompetence. So there's really no motivation or reason to seek to get better at their jobs or to do better at their jobs, because there's really no confidence if they don't. So that's kind of a running theme throughout the show. And it's one of those things, like, yeah, it's fictional, but at no point are you watching this and thinking, oh man, this is just so far out there, this isn't what it's like. Like, the whole time you're thinking, wow, yeah, this is probably fairly accurate. So the other thing with the final season was it's all focused on the primary season within her party. So, again, most likely the Democratic Party, but they don't come out and say it. So you kind of get this, like, this mirror of the Trump versus Hillary thing, with Jonah Ryan acting as Trump. At one point he gets on a big anti-vax kick, and he's talking about why. I think he's in Pennsylvania, and he was saying Pennsylvania is the number 2 state for the least amount of vaccinations, and by the time he's president, they'll get it down to number 1 least vaccinated. And then he ends up getting chickenpox and giving it to his stepfather, and it ends up actually killing him, which it's actually funny because it turns out to be his actual father. So at one point he marries. You come to find out in the first episode that he's got married, and he's married this girl who it turns out was his stepsister, and they had lived together for like a year when they were in high school when their parents were married, and then Jonah's mom divorced. They got divorced, and so it's this kind of like weird, kind of gross thing. And then it turns out that guy is actually Jonah's dad. So he turns out to marry. He married his half sister, which is just kind of a funny thing, and obviously a play on kind of Trump's weird infatuation with his daughter. And then his campaign manager Amy, who is kind of this like shy, always on her phone, personality, kind of described as shrill often by people throughout the show. She takes over as campaign manager, I think, early on in the season, and becomes like a Kellyanne Conway. So it's pretty funny. And then at one point Jonah becomes he finds out that math, are the numerals that we use, and the basic math that we use was, created, or whatever, I guess created in the Middle East. It's Arabic numerals, all that kind of stuff. So he starts this whole thing about how they're teaching our kids Muslim math, and he starts claiming to use Christian math at one point, which is really funny. And then quite blatantly, and I think they were intending to hide it at all, Selena is very much representing Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. And one of the first reasons, or the first, I think maybe it was the first episode or the second episode, she's like writing her speech, for her entrance speech, for when she's in Iowa and she's going to be throwing her hat in the ring. And she's, talking with her assistant Gary, who's like her bag man. He's been with her from the start. He's like constantly is whispering in her ear information about whoever it is she's speaking to, so it looks like she's knowledgeable. He just basically does everything and anything and everything for her. And so he's typing everything out, and she just basically says, the real reason that I'm running is because it's my turn. And I feel like that was, oh man, as soon as I heard that, I was like, dude, that's Hillary Clinton in a nutshell. Like, it's the only reason that she's running is because she feels that it's her turn, and that it was her time. And that was kind of a theme throughout the show, is you never really got an idea of what Selena's policies were, especially because she would change very flippantly in order to get whatever she wanted, which is also very much like Hillary Clinton. And so, kind of in the same way, it's like, no, my policies aren't important. Who I am as a person and how horrible of a person I am isn't important. What's important is that it's my turn. I'm due up. This is my time. And so, like, for instance, when it gets to the end, to the last episode, she sacrifices gay marriage. She says they'll change the plank, and she'll do what she can to to overturn the law, in order to get support from one of the other candidates for president who's seeking the nomination, which is also kind of weird. They really played, it worked, as far as Jonah representing Trump and Selena representing Hillary, and I get why they had to do it the way that they did, but it was kind of funny to see, like, okay, these people are supposed to be in the same party, and it's quite clear he's supposed to be the Democratic Party, yet they have a guy who's like extremely anti-gay marriage. And so it was just kind of funny to watch, because it didn't really fit, but it worked. And it was, again, it worked out, and it was good. And I get why they had to do it that way, because it wasn't gonna be feasible to have an opposite opponent represent that. And it was easy to buy into Jonah being that type of guy. He's got this really toxic personality. He's just a huge douchebag, and then he kind of stumbles into realizing that people are responding to his douchebaggery, and the more he amplifies it, the more support that he gets. So it totally makes sense in that kind of way. But yeah, so she sacrifices gay marriage And her daughter is a lesbian and married, and so like obviously causes tension there. And then she also sacrifices Gary, the bagman that I was talking about, the guy that's been through thick and thin for her, literally would do anything for her. She basically implicates him in this huge scandal that her ex-husband perpetuated, and so Gary gets arrested at the convention when Selena's up giving her speech accepting the nomination for president. You see him getting taken away by the FBI, and then the show ends with you skip forward and she's in the White House and she's talking to people and she clears them out. She clears everybody out of her office, and she just goes, the incompetence in this office, and then she kind of trails off and is just kind of sitting there alone in the Oval Office, and you just kind of realize that she got to where she finally wanted to, but kind of what was the cost? She doesn't have Gary anymore, and she did everything necessary to get there. And then it skips forward another 24 years to her funeral. You come to find out she only got the one term. She wasn't reelected. You come to find out, oh, that's the other thing she does. She put Jonah on her ticket as the vice president, which caused even some of her people who have seen her be awful. Throughout this entire season, she's also working with the Chinese to try to steal the election, and they're running interference and messing with the election. Again, obviously a allusion to 2016. And she even at one point promises the Chinese president that he can have Tibet back if he's willing to not try to help President Montez win re-election, but help her. So again, just a horrible person. But she has people that have seen her do all of that. And then when she's willing to put Jonah on the ticket as VP, she has one of her advisors, breaks and starts yelling at her about that. Amy, who's the Kellyanne Conway type character, is begging her, even though it's her that's the she's the campaign manager for that. She's begging her not to do it, and she just snaps at all of them and says she's gonna do it anyway. And so then she ends up only getting the one term. You find out Jonah was impeached at one point, and then the only good guy in the entire series, I mean good as in like virtuous and not a piece of garbage, is a guy named Richard Splett, who is hilarious. And he comes in, I don't know, in season like 3 or 4, maybe even earlier, maybe 2. But he, throughout this season, like somehow becomes the mayor of his old hometown. Eventually gets up into the lieutenant governor's seat. The governor gets shingles, so then he becomes the governor. He becomes the secretary of agriculture on Selena's administration in her cabinet. And then in that, you come to find out he's president at that time. He's solved the Palestinian-Israeli issue with a 3-state solution, is what they refer to it as. And so it's kind of good to see that happen. The only good character in the show, and it was really, aside from Gary, which it really sucks. You come to find out like she never visited him in prison and all this other stuff, and you can tell he's still heartbroken about it, and he's still loyal to her. He like puts this lipstick on her coffin. Aside from him, and because it was just really sad, kind of what went down with him. Everybody else got what they deserved. Like, none of them are doing great, and they all kind of end up in situations that they deserved based on how awful of people that they were. And so, kind of how this relates, obviously, to like the real world. It's one, the corruption. You see it. It's been referred to by multiple different people as the most accurate portrayal of DC that's on TV. And again, like I said, when you're watching it, at no point are you like, wow, this is over the top. This is just crazy. This can't be what it's like. You're like, oh yeah, this is probably exactly. Excuse me. This is probably exactly what it's like. Um, you had the West Wing back in the day, and you had House of Cards. So West Wing was obviously a really positive portrayal um, of politics, and then House of Cards was probably more accurate than West Wing, but it got pretty outlandish and got into some crazy things. I hold very low opinions of almost every president that's ever served in the United States, but I don't think none of them have a problem with calling in drone strikes that kill tons of innocent civilians. None of them are losing any sleep at night, I would guess, over the tens of thousands of innocent people that they've all killed. At least the past few, 4 or 5 at least presidents. But I don't think any of them have actually physically murdered somebody like Kevin Spacey does in House of Cards. So again, I think it's a little outlandish, whereas this show has been talked about as how accurate of a portrayal it is, which is hilarious. Again, the show is incredibly funny, but also very sad that it's that accurate of a portrayal, and that at no point when you're watching it do you feel like it's outlandish. The whole time you're like, yeah, it seems about right. As you see Selena doing all these things, at no point you're like, man, I can't believe she did that. It's like, no, they're portraying her exactly as willing to do whatever she can or whatever she needs to get to where she wants to go. Remember, it's her turn now. And so yeah, throughout the entirety, and absolutely 100% is that an accurate representation of Hillary Clinton. And so that's just it's kind of funny to see that, and to remember back to when the 2016 election was going on, and especially being here in Austin, it's a heavily Democrat city, and people are like, I just don't understand how anybody could ever vote for Trump or support Trump or anything like that. And I would just say to those people, I'm like, look, I can understand why you feel that way, but the way you feel about Trump is the exact same way a hell of a lot of people feel about Hillary Clinton, myself included. I would never in a million years vote for Hillary Clinton, ever. She's a horrible human being. So it's just kind of something to remember when you're talking about this system that we're in. Is a lot of times that's what it comes down to. You're picking between two horrible people, and this system tends to attract predominantly those types of individuals. They're seeking out power not because they want to do right by the world, not because they want to make the world a better place, but because they want that power. They want to be able to exert control over other people's lives, people that they've never met, and people that they don't know anything about, but they want to be able to exert control over their lives, and they want to make a ton of money doing it. Trump may be the only person that comes out of the White House and doesn't end up richer than he was before. Although maybe he will, considering how much money he's lost throughout his life. But every single president comes out. The Clintons claimed to be in debt whenever they came out of the White House. Yet, they're worth how much now? How much of that Clinton Foundation money have they funneled into their own pockets? Ask Katie about that one. The Obamas signed a $60 million Netflix special for whatever the hell it is. Michelle got her book deal. When things like that happen, that's not like, the Netflix one may have just been a straight up tit for tat with the net neutrality thing and Obama pushing that, because all of the biggest tech companies wanted net neutrality, which should tell you a lot about what net neutrality truly is, but that's neither here nor there. But whenever you see stuff like this happen, you just There's a reason these people become so rich when they get out of office. And it's not because they were just such a shining beacon of liberty and justice and goodness during their time that people just want to give them the opportunity to, do shows or books or all that kind of stuff. It's a tit for tat thing. And so when we're talking about the state and government and talking about how horrible most of these people are, don't get me wrong, I think there are a small, minute amount of people involved in the government who are truly doing so with the intention of doing right by people and trying to make their lives better. Again, I think that is a tiny amount. I think probably 98% of the people involved in the government are either doing so because they want the power and they want to exert that control over people, or they're just straight up incompetent. And they're almost as equally as deadly when you're talking about the power of the government. So when you're looking at this, and when we're talking about government, when we're talking about the state, this is again why it comes down to trust. Who do you trust? And for me, that's never going to be the government. So I want the government involved in the smallest possible way in my life, and to be able to exert the smallest amount of control over my life and have the smallest influence in my personal life and in the lives of everybody else because of that reason. Because oftentimes you're picking between two horrible individuals because of the way the system works. You're having to pick. They gave us Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. That's god awful. That is awful. And again, this is when you're talking about a show like Veep, and when you watch it, and when you don't feel like it is outlandish, and when you feel like, yeah, this is probably pretty damn close to how it actually is there, it's just another example of why the government should be severely limited. Severely limited. Because it's going to abuse every single power it is given. No matter what. It is going to abuse whatever powers we give it. And once we give up something, good luck getting it back. Once you give up a right or a freedom, good luck getting it back. So that's that's going to be it. Just again, just keep that in mind when you're looking at something, and I've already decided what the next podcast episode is it's gonna kind of piggyback off of this and talk about the way in which we deify politicians. So we're gonna get into that more, but just remember that, whenever we're talking about government, or whenever you're thinking about government, or there's an election coming up or anything like that, at the end of the day, these are just other people. They're not ordained by some higher power or by nature to be better leaders, or to be capable of wielding power more effectively, or to be better decision makers, or to know what's best for you in your life better than you do. They're just people. A lot of them are awful people. A lot of them are just people that probably aren't very good at their job, and they don't really care that much, and they can't really get fired a lot of the time. Just remember that. There's nothing special about any of these people. So there's no reason to be giving them any sort of special power or control over our lives. And let's just make sure that they can have as little impact on all of our lives as possible. It's not just for me that I talk about this. I don't want them involved in your life either. If you want to involve them, all right, go ahead. That's your call. But as far as them just being able to exert power and control and influence without any form of consent, I don't want that for you either. So anyway, we'll get that next podcast episode recorded probably tomorrow night or maybe Thursday night, and just kind of again piggyback off of this and talk about the way in which the American political system tends to deify politicians. So thanks again for listening. I really appreciate it. If you are enjoying the show, please subscribe, rate, and review it. Let your friends know, anybody that you think might be interested in this. And I'll see y'all soon. You are a sovereign individual, and thanks again for listening, y'all.